it's going to be very difficult for China to have the kind of relationship that it looked for with the European Union. It wanted to divide the European Union from the United States so that it could continue to label the United States as the only problem in the world. The European Union is its biggest trading partner. All of this has been compromised by the war in Ukraine. On the other side, I think that it's fairly clear that Xi Jinping doesn't want Vladimir Putin to fall. There's a very long border. There's a history of very complicated relations between Russia and China. They haven't always been best friends, even in the time of communism. There was a serious standoff from the early 1960s through the 70s, and that's a border. That's a 3,000-kilometer border that you have to militarize, that you have to fortify when you have a problem with Russia. They don't want a problem with Russia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time a year after the US president last met with his Chinese counterpart, we'll be taking the temperature of their relationship after their face-to-face in San Francisco and asking what it means for global security. Joining us is Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, an independent non-profit organisation. Isabel, really great to have you on Frontline. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Before this meeting, how hostile would you judge relations to have been between the US and China? And has it done anything to improve them?
They were pretty dire, to be honest, and have been deteriorating for since the Trump presidency. They've been deteriorating, and this is a pretty long-term systemic thing. You know, the description from both sides of the relationship was that it was the worst it had been for 40 years. So we were in pretty deep water in terms of US-China relations at a time when, in a sense, they'd never had more at stake. You know, the huge trade flows between them, the world's first and second biggest economies, the world's first and second biggest climate polluters. You know, they had everything to talk about, and they really weren't talking.
And what do you think has led to that breakdown in relations? Can you just sum up the inventory of things that's gone wrong?
Well, it's partly Chinese ambition. You know, after the Kissinger and the Nixon visit and the opening up of China under Deng Xiaoping, there was a sense that if China were to prosper, if China were to join in globalization, China joined the World Trade Organization, Western investors moved into China, a lot of industrial operations moved to China, and the sense was that China would gradually, as it were, normalize. It would have a less autocratic system. It would share power in different ways. It would build a legal system. It would build the apparatus of a more constitutional state, less of a communist Leninist state. And for a while, that certainly seemed to be happening. And then it really went into reverse around 2007, 2008, when the party began to reassert control. And the United States had to face up to the fact that it was dealing with a form of authoritarian capitalism, which was very successful in itself because China had a strategic industrial policy which allowed it to foster native industries, which would then compete on US territory, but also in third markets with the United States. But also that it had strategic ambitions which directly conflicted with the United States. And it began to assert those ambitions. So then we had two superpowers, instead of being on a kind of a course of rapprochement, of becoming more like each other, we had two superpowers which were firmly in systemic competition. And so Chinese security analysts began to see China as the major security threat. China was building up its armed forces. China had unresolved issues over Taiwan, for example, but also over the dominance of all that part of the Pacific, which, you know, had also been United States, you know, field of operations. So we got into a strategic and economic competition. We got into trade barriers. Things declined. And with the rise in nationalism on both sides, each leader, if you like, was portraying the other as the enemy. So Trump would talk about China in disparaging terms. And inside China, the United States was painted as the source of all China's problems and as a power that was trying to stop China's legitimate rise. So in addition to the objective facts of the competition, you had the domestic political factors, which made it very difficult, I think, to relax the confrontation.
Yeah, and ahead of this meeting, expectations were set deliberately low, take into consideration the most recent kind of problems. You mentioned the unfair trade allegations, intellectual property theft allegations, COVID-19 pandemic, spy balloons, and of course, China's support or lack of criticism of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Do you sense there has been any progress made? Because we have had this announcement now that military communications will resume between the two countries, at least.
Yes, well, that's important because you mentioned Balloon Gate, the famous spy balloon, which was discovered drifting across the United States. Quite why it was drifting across the United States remains fairly unclear. It may well have just been off course, but as we know, it was shot down. Now, when it was first tracked, the United States the military made efforts to contact their counterparts in the Chinese military, and the Chinese just wouldn't pick up the phone. Now, if you look at what's happening in the South China Sea, where China has essentially taken operational control of the South China Sea by militarizing atolls, building up islands, artificial islands, and militarizing despite promising that they wouldn't. The United States Navy and allied navies are conducting what are called freedom of navigation operations because these are international waters. And on a couple of occasions recently, these have come perilously close to collision with Chinese naval forces. Were that to happen, or were, for example, there to be a repetition of the 1991 episode in which an American spy plane in international airspace was in collision with a Chinese fighter jet. The Chinese pilot died. The American managed to land, but obviously there was a standoff of his return. These are episodes which could easily escalate in the current climate into serious incidents. So military to military communications are absolutely vital. You have to understand what the other side is doing in order not to misinterpret it. So that is an important step forward, I think.
Just how perilous do you think it's been then while the communications have not been ongoing?
Well, it's been extremely dangerous. We don't know what restraints there are on the Chinese side, but as soon as somebody dies on either side, as soon as there is a collision, then you have a very inflamed situation very quickly, and with no communications, it has been extremely dangerous.
Um, Joe Biden has said that one outcome from this meeting would be to be able to pick up the phone and to talk to another if there's a crisis. And that is case in point, what we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
How do you think President Putin will react to this resumption or a slightly closening of the relationship?
As long as it doesn't affect China's support for him, which I very much doubt that it will, then I don't see why he should be concerned. You know, one notable absence from the communique was really any progress on Ukraine, because China is supporting Russia in Ukraine. It's not just tolerating it. There is mounting evidence of the supply of what's called dual-use technology, and that can include drones. For example, we have a battlefield which is a sort of combination of World War One, in that men in trenches slugging it out, and the World War III, which is the use of advanced electronics. So drones are absolutely critical, as we know, and China is supplying Russia with drones. So this has gone beyond diplomatic neutrality. This is well into material support. Also, the visit of the North Korean leader and the agreement that North Korea would supply Russia with military materiel. Again, I'm sure China had a hand in that. And that was not in the communique.
On the subject of Ukraine, yeah, maybe not in the communique, but it's conceivable they would have talked about it, isn't it?
I can't imagine they didn't talk about it. They would have talked about all the hotspots. They would have talked about Israel, Gaza, certainly Taiwan, South China Sea, and Ukraine. And the United States would have made its views clear. But the relationship with Russia is described by Xi Jinping, as you know, as a friendship without limits. There have been repeated visits between the two since the Ukraine war. There's certainly no boycott of Russia by China or vice versa. China has bought increasing quantities of Russian oil at good prices for China, but also helpful for Russia. And Putin was in China just a couple of weeks ago as the honoured guest at the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there is no slackening of China's big smile on Russia, and that is, that I think that is definitely a problem.
Against that backdrop, how much trust can there realistically be between the two presidents?
Well, I think we're back to sort of trust and verify. You have to, if you're talking and reaching agreements, you have to have an assumption of good faith on each side. But you would be foolish not to verify that the agreements were being honoured. China tends, I mean, I suppose big powers all behave badly, and we can certainly, find occasions when the United States has failed to honour agreements that it's entered into. On trade, for example, it routinely breaks WTO rules when it's in its interests. China has promised things which it has failed to deliver. Xi Jinping did promise Obama that he would not militarize the South China Sea. As I've said, he militarized it. There was a trade deal between Trump and Xi Jinping in which China promised to buy much more substantial quantities of US agricultural exports. That didn't really happen. So, these things are not guarantees. But the fact that they are prepared publicly to pledge to do something, and this pledge, of course, is being publicized in China as well as in the United States, means that there is at least a moral obligation to try to honor it publicly. And if they don't, they have to produce a good explanation as to why.
I was going to say, as you said, no communique on Ukraine, and you mentioned and detailed China's support for the war in Ukraine and for Russia. How much do you believe? I mean, China's been cited before as being potentially the answer to resolving the problems there, bringing the sides together. But how much do you think China really wants that war to end?
There are positives and negatives for China for the war. The positive, if you assume a strategic competition with the United States, is that a lot of money and armaments are going to that theatre from the United States, which might otherwise be held in reserve for a problem in the Asia Pacific. So there's distraction, there's expenditure, and that's a plus for China. NATO and the United States have more than enough on their hands at the moment. So it is a lifting of any pressure on China. It's got cheap oil and gas, as I said, but there are big negatives. It has done serious damage to China's relationship with the European Union. And China has been trying to repair that without a lot of success, because certainly the frontline states, which are now in the European Union, thinking of the Baltic states and Poland, are very clear about Ukraine, and they are very clear about China's position on Ukraine. So it's going to be very difficult for China to have the kind of relationship that it looked for with the European Union. It wanted to divide the European Union from the United States so that it could continue to label the United States as the only problem in the world. The European Union is its biggest trading partner. All of this has been compromised by the war in Ukraine. On the other side, I think that it's fairly clear that Xi Jinping doesn't want Vladimir Putin to fall. There's a very long border. There's a history of very complicated relations between Russia and China. They haven't always been best friends. Even in the time of communism, there was a serious standoff from the early 1960s through the 70s. and that's a border, that's a 3,000 kilometer border that you have to militarize, that you have to fortify when you have a problem with Russia. They don't want a problem with Russia. They don't want Vladimir Putin to fall, and the uncertainty that that would create. So, they're handling it as China handles it, by saying as little as possible. I don't think China is going to take any risks over Ukraine in the sense of trying to negotiate a peace and failing. China tends to be more passive than that, and trying to minimize its sort of active diplomacy.
So we need to talk about Taiwan, don't we? Xi Jinping has reasserted China's ambition to reclaim Taiwan. He said that its absorption is inevitable and has told the US to stop sending arms. I mean, are you going to say he would say that, wouldn't he?
Yes, he would say that, wouldn't he? The US has been arming Taiwan since the early 70s, since the Taiwan Relations Act, because the price, if you like, of shifting diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing was a guarantee for Taiwan. And the guarantee, which has been described as strategic ambiguity, but it does commit the United States to giving Taiwan the means to defend itself. And it has done that ever since. Every time there is a major uptick in the level of armaments given to Taiwan, there is a Chinese protest, of course. What remains ambiguous is what exactly the United States would do were there to be an attack on Taiwan. And Joe Biden has tended to cross that line. When asked if the United States would go to Taiwan's assistance, he has said yes on a few occasions, and the White House had hastily had to walk that back, because that's not the official position. The official position is strategic ambiguity, leaving the Chinese in doubt as to whether an attack on Taiwan would involve, in the end, a war with the United States. And that's an important doubt if you're a planner. Xi Jinping also said on this occasion, apparently, that he was annoyed that US officials had been claiming that that China was planning to attack Taiwan in 2027 or 2030. These were slightly puzzling remarks, which we all looked at and said, well, what's the evidence for that? And it's not that solid. I mean, obviously, we don't know what Xi Jinping's real intentions are, or how he calculates risk. And he has been telling the armed forces to be ready for an invasion. But that is about the only thing Chinese armed forces need to be ready for. So, of course, he would be telling them that. And even telling them that can be read as a kind of grey zone tactic to intimidate Taiwan. It doesn't necessarily mean they're planning to invade, planning actively to invade on that date.
Do you think China has actually decided how it is going to pursue its ambitions over Taiwan, or do you think it's sitting there and waiting to see, for example, what happens in Ukraine?
I think that, it would sensibly keep its strategic options open. It's learning lessons from Ukraine. It's learning lessons about how to circumvent, for example, sanctions, economic sanctions. It's trying to build up as much of its trade as it can in renminbi as opposed to the dollar, or in, rubles, in local currencies anyway, to avoid being completely stymied by being shut out of the dollar trading system. It's still, that is going to make insufficient progress, in my view, to make a substantial difference. But there are important differences between Ukraine and Taiwan, the obvious one being that Taiwan's an island. That makes a military assault extremely complicated and difficult. There are very few landing beaches. But it also makes it complicated for people to escape, for example, for refugees. It also makes it very complicated for resupply for any ally of Taiwan's. So it's complicated on both sides. It's also highly volatile, because if you were serious about a military assault on Taiwan, you might think, if you were Chinese, that you would have to take out the US assets in the region, and they're in Japan, in South Korea, in the Philippines. And then you're in a wider war in the Pacific very early. So it is a very, very big gamble to do this. And there are strategic assets like TSMC, which is the company that makes the world's most advanced chips, computer chips. It's on Taiwan. you could destroy that in an assault. You could get bogged down, as the Russians are in Ukraine, in a very long fight, an exhausting fight, which just drained your assets and killed your soldiers. So it's a big calculation. And there's a much misquoted Chinese military strategist called Sun Tzu, who's 2,000 years of military strategy of Sun Tzu. One of the things that Sun Tzu did say was the best war is the one you don't have to fight. And for Taiwan and China, that means there is a whole range of pressure points that could be applied to Taiwan over time, which would not involve military action, which would be much harder for the West to respond to, or for the American to respond to. And they include economic blockade. They might include intermittent blockade of the Taiwan Straits, which the Chinese have declared a domestic waterway. This continuing pressure of incursions of Chinese military aircraft very close to Taiwanese airspace, forcing the Taiwanese Air Force to scramble all the time. That's exhausting for everybody. Firing rockets over Taiwan. Taiwan depends on China economically, trade embargoes. Um, Black ops, all these things are available, and you can demoralize a country. You can try to manipulate the upcoming election, for example. There's an election in January where you might get a more favorable Taiwanese government, a government that was prepared to talk at least. All these things are available before a military operation and have much less risk.
There was a defence diplomacy gathering in Beijing at the end of October where China's top general, General Jang, second in line after the president, he warned against other countries interfering in regional issues. He denounced the US for encouraging colour revolutions, it's quoted, a reference to uprisings against old Soviet era
Yeah.
rule. The message is clear, isn't it? Keep your nose out.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, the color revolution warning comes from Putin. Putin warned Xi Jinping many years ago against foreign NGOs, for example, or foreign information, because Putin likes to blame all the revolts against Soviet rule on the West, on the United States. And and China picked up that line and has run with it ever since. So anything that happens in China, any protest in China, is blamed on the United States, and that means that anyone who does protest is liable to be accused of being a traitor and in the pay of the United States. It's that's just political propaganda. But keep out of the region is not just about color revolutions. It's also about a US military presence, or, for example, NATO's warmer relations with Japan caused some concern, or the new configurations, the AUKUS, the kind of strategic block building that's been going on over the last 8 or 9 years as China's military strength has grown, and as China itself pursued a far more assertive policy in the region. So wolf warrior diplomacy, the South China Sea, all the things we've been talking about precipitated a response, of course, from the United States and its allies. And, that is partly, those are the building blocks of the dangerous moment that we're in, which is why it's good they're talking.
To what extent do you think that China is building a narrative of a belligerent US to try and garner support amongst new allies that it may be building in this now multipolar world?
Absolutely. That's a really important part of China's strategy. In addition to the things we've been discussing, over the past 10 years, China has been setting up a whole series of mini and multilateral fora. So, for example, you've heard of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the oldest one. There's the Belt and Road Initiative. There's a thing called FOCAC, which is China's entity for relations with Africa, which has enormous summits in Beijing with African leaders. There's CELAC in Latin America. There was 16, 17 plus one in Europe, but that's pretty much moribund. But all of these fora and the BRICS, of course, which they want to expand, These are ways of China exerting influence in a global order which it increasingly describes as unfair and US dominated. So everything that was set up after World War II, it in which China has participated actually since they were set up, but it now describes as being weighted against not only China but emerging economies. So China has positioned itself as a kind of leader of what we used to call the third world. And this echoes slightly, the Bandung position of the non-aligned countries, with China firmly in the position as the largest non-aligned country. But it's taken on a more assertive quality because China wishes to use this influence to limit US power, to discredit, if you like, US intentions. And it's having some success. So if you look at votes in the United Nations, for example, on topics like Ukraine, or even in the European Union, where China's interests are in play, so for example, criticisms of the human rights record in Xinjiang, you'll find allies of China. In the European Union, it's Greece. In ASEAN, it's Cambodia. And in the United Nations, it's, a large block of countries which have China as their biggest trade partner, or, are BRI members, that simply vote the Chinese interest. And so the United States can no longer guarantee any kind of dominance in the institutions that we have lived with for the past 60, 70 years. And China is out to change the global order in that sense. It's out to change the definition of human rights. China has a whole series of initiatives which look slightly meaningless. Things like phrases like, a common destiny for all mankind, and those are actually part of a strategy to change the global narrative. So we have things which, again, people are not aware of, like the Global Cultural Initiative, the Global Defense Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, sorry, the Global Security Initiative and the Global Defense Initiative. These are all Chinese formulations of the global order, which have seeded into the global conversation and will gain strength as time goes on, because they're presented as a counterweight to American influence and the American view of the world. So it's discrediting liberal democracy. It's discrediting the United States as a superpower, and it is advancing China as the champion of the rest of the emerging world.
If China is wanting to discredit the US as a superpower, might it also want to try and paint it as, make it the scapegoat for its slowing economy back home in a way that might be attractive to say, well, it's all the US's fault? And if that is the case, how do you think the US should handle that?
Well, there is an element of that, and I think Xi Jinping's enthusiasm for this meeting is partly a reflection of the fact that foreign direct investment in China has been declining quite sharply, and that's partly the pandemic, but it's also the fact that conditions for expats in China have become extremely delicate. China has a whole series of security laws, which means, for example, if you're doing just basic due diligence on a Chinese company for an investor, you can be accused of espionage. So life has got really quite difficult. So people are pulling out, and people are not exactly pulling out their existing investments, but the future investments are certainly in fairly serious decline. And that matters to Xi Jinping because the economy is being very slow to recover from COVID. And it's at one of those kind of turning points that every Asian tiger has reached, where you've exhausted all the first advantages of the catch-up economy and you need to avoid the middle income trap. It is absolutely unclear if China is going to avoid the middle income trap. So, of course, everything that happens in China has to be the fault of somebody else, because if you present yourself as the wise and omniscient leader, and the leader with, all the keys to happiness and success, then anything that goes wrong can't be blamed on you. And that's definitely happening. And the United States the United States is responsible in some respects, not for the basic problems of the Chinese economy, but it is explicitly trying to limit China's access to advanced technologies because it sees them as potentially threatening.
To what extent do you think both of these leaders came to this meeting with problems at home? Biden facing resurgent Trump, doubts from inside his party, and China, as we said, a troubled economy and coming out of a summer of military purges. Do you think they both came sort of slightly with low expectations, but from a point of slight challenging moments back home?
Well, definitely, and each of them will be aware of not only of their own challenges, but of the challenges the other is facing. And what's been quite interesting about this meeting is the change in the mood music in China. You know, the Chinese press have been slagging off the United States for years now, and suddenly we are into a kind of rather positive tone, presented, of course, as the United States, you know, responding to the sweet reason of China and the initiative all being on Xi Jinping's side. But it's still a significant change in tone because it does, you know, create the space for a lessening of hostilities. Um, I think that perhaps they both, you know, they both have enough problems at the moment that a continuing confrontation was a problem that they felt that they had to handle. And we were in a situation where something unexpected could happen. And right now, with two wars going on, and another unexpected situation in Asia would have been quite unwelcome, I think, for both sides.
How good do you think the US's intelligence is on China? How well do you think it understands it?
Well, it's become increasingly difficult, I think, to understand China because access has become more difficult because we're not having these face-to-face conversations across a broad spectrum that we used to have because the number of journalists has dropped because the whole party mechanisms have become more opaque and more centralized on the leader. But there's an additional problem that the United States has, which that it's essentially its espionage network was compromised about 10 years ago. There were a lot of executions, and it really took a terrible hit. So whilst evidently its intelligence on Russia is very good, at least it has been so far, its intelligence on China, it doesn't have the same eyes in China that it once had or that it has in Russia. So a lot of understanding of China is based on the reading of the documents, the whatever electronic surveillance is still functioning, but a lot of it is analysis rather than direct access intelligence. So intelligence is a tricky business anyway, and I think it's just not as well set up in China as it is elsewhere.
And just finally, Isabel, if I could do a little bit of UK navel gazing here, we have a new Foreign Secretary and the old Prime Minister, Lord Cameron. I mean, famously, he talked of this golden era of relations with China. How do you think, what do you think the fundamental understanding we should have of China should be and about how relations should work with it?
Yes, I think I don't think we're going to see a return to the golden era, which after all was we're still untangling some of the mistakes that the golden era made. Huawei 5G. Do we really want China building nuclear power plants and operating them in this country? When the trust essentially goes, your relationship changes, and there was an assumption of infinite trust in the golden era that was not well founded. So what we have defaulted to, along with the European Union and the United States, is a kind of tripartite take on China, which is we cooperate where we can. When asked about where we can cooperate, everyone says climate, and that's sensible. We confront where we need to, and we compete. So pretty much in maybe with slightly different words, that three-part kind of take is where everybody has landed, because you can't ignore China. It would be foolish, and anyway, it's impossible. We are deeply entwined economically and strategically in so many ways, and you can't at the same time. There are very important problems: authoritarian capitalism and how you live with that in a world of liberal economies. I think it doesn't work anymore. So the United States has had to adopt an industrial strategy, rather as China does. Britain has yet to do that. There are many aspects to this relationship which are going to take a lot more strategy and a lot more thought and go beyond the slogans. And we're really just at the beginning of that, I think.
I sense another conversation in the near future. Isabel, Hilton, lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.